Hello and welcome to the NOLA in Your Neighborhood panel on Innovating for Equity, hosted by Teach for America Greater New Orleans. My name is Alison Mehr and I'm the Managing Director of External Affairs for TFA GNO, and I'm also an alum of the program. We're so glad that you joined us today. In this discussion, we're going to explore how 4 local leaders created innovative solutions to address the inequities that they saw in our community, highlighted by the events of the past year. This event is part of Teach for America Greater New Orleans 30 by 30 series, celebrating 30 years of impact in Louisiana, brought to you by our partners at Entergy. Since 1990, TFA has brought over 3,000 teachers to schools in Greater New Orleans and the surrounding parishes. Many of those teachers have continued to work in our communities alongside local partners and TFA alumni from other regions across the country, and some of them joined us today. We've invited 3 TFA alumni leaders from the school, district, and business communities, as well as a dedicated local philanthropic leader to join us today to share how they used their leadership to advocate for equity in the Greater New Orleans community during this very challenging time. So panelists, if you would please introduce yourselves to our guests. Patty Riddlebarger, will you start us off?
My name is Patty Riddlebarger. I'm Vice President of Social Responsibility for Entergy Corporation, headquartered here in New Orleans, but we have operations across Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, New York, Michigan. I think that's it, yeah, New York and Michigan. So across the Northeast and the Southeast.
Okay, and Jacob, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Jacob Landry. I'm a native Louisianian, New Orleanian of about 10 years. I got my start after college in Teach for America as a teacher, and then worked in policy and advocacy for about 10 years before founding and running Urban South Brewery. So we're the largest brewery in New Orleans and the 6th fastest growing regional brewery in the country.
Melanie, how about you?
Hello, everyone. I'm Melanie Askew. I am the founder and head of school of Élan Academy Charter School located in Algiers. We opened in fall 2017, and currently we educate students pre-K 4 through 5th grade and are adding a grade level every year until we are a full pre-K 4 through 8th grade school. We are a classical education model for the 21st century. I'm glad to be here. I'm also a 2012 TFA Memphis core member.
And last but not least, Dina.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Dina Hasiotis. I'm the Chief School Support and Improvement Officer at NOLA Public Schools. I actually started my career in education as a O2 core member here in New Orleans. I taught it in a car across on the West Bank, 7th grade. So New Orleans education has always had my heart, and over the years I've worked in policy nationally and locally, and joined the school district about 5 years ago as we plan to reunify and support and oversee all schools citywide.
Wonderful. So a lot has happened over the past years, March 2020, when the entire country was forced to make really drastic changes that affected our communities on all fronts. This is work, this is school, this is home. So we've seen national and global unrest in response to COVID, but also due to issues of racism, political extremism, massive inequities that have been highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, among other things. So for us at Teach for America, this really all started when school buildings closed on March 13th, Friday the 13th last year. And our school partners and teachers really had to quickly find ways to support their students and families. So Dina, as one of the leaders working at the school district level, you've had a front row seat to what was happening both statewide and locally. So how did these equity issues affect your work, and how did NOLA Public Schools respond with the lens of what do you do as a leader, and how do you think about equity for kids that are massively affected by the schools shutting down?
Sure. Well, I'll say, it's about a year ago we had to start to make these decisions exactly. So it's been a year of, I will say, a dogged focus on ensuring the best for our students and families in the city of New Orleans. And I think, New Orleans Public Schools is a system that is primarily African-American and over 80% economically disadvantaged students. So the issues of racism, of classism, of all the sort of inequities that exist and have been highlighted as of over the past year in ways for everyone to see in a variety of ways. It's not new to New Orleans Public Schools or our school leaders in the way in which the schools that Melanie leads as well. And we're an entity that has sort of been designed to think about how do we close inequities. Our charge is to make sure that students get the best that they can every day from their school experience academically and also socially and emotionally. And so when COVID was presented to us about a year ago and it became a sense of urgency, not that we don't already have one, to address some of the biggest inequities that we knew would start to confront our students and our families. And so, and sitting at the district level, it was interesting to see because it is a time that no one knew where to go or what answers there were to be found or what to do. And I recall actually in the early days, I was taking guidances from the CDC. We didn't have state guidance yet. And I was fielding calls from our school leaders to say, I think I know someone who may be getting sick, right? And so it was a time where you had to think fast and you had to quickly prioritize. And I think in those moments, the prioritization became, how do we meet the core and basic needs of our schools? Because in our seat, we think about how do we support our schools as they support students and families. And so the challenges that we saw sort of at first, and then actually, and I'll talk a little bit over the sort of in those first few months versus where we've been over the past years around inequities. The first were really, how do we make sure students are whole? How do they have the food they need? And how do they actually have the technology when we were forced to close our doors to engage with their teachers and their peers? And so right off the bat, we knew we have some families where that was not going to be a problem, but that is the minority within our school community. And so we had to think quickly about how do we mobilize within a decentralized system where we have 36 charter management organizations and 78 different schools to just make sure we can coordinate where it makes sense so that the mission that drives all of us could succeed. And so focusing first on food, we were able to get food services up and running day one of school closure. Thanks to the entrepreneurial spirit of our school leaders and our educators in the city. And also in our seat at the district, thinking about how do we navigate what we're hearing from the state and how do we think fast on our feet to make the right decisions and stay focused on that core need. And then the second piece that we quickly, we were actually investigating and really about thinking ahead on before we had to close schools was technology. We already knew our students were not going to have access to Wi-Fi or internet for many of them. We didn't know how many. So that's one thing that's actually been interesting to sort of learn how big is the gap as we've gone along the way. But we moved quickly before even having to close schools to start to source both internet and technology solutions for our schools. And I think what's unique about New Orleans in particular and our entrepreneurial spirit is that given the way our schools are designed, my role at the district, I could be doing that. While our school leaders were focusing on how do I make sure I get the right, give my students the information, keep teaching them, get the materials that I can in their hands today, while we then sort of had a very good sort of delineation of responsibilities where we were working on this bigger issue that we could tackle while they were working on a huge issue that they could tackle. And it was, in those early days, we were probably one of the first school districts in the nation to make one of the largest orders for technology and hotspots, thanks to support from also corporate partners like Entergy on this call to help us make some of those really bold decisions early on, given the commitment that was driving us in those early days to make sure that inequity gaps could be closed as soon as possible. And again, focusing on the most prescient to help students be whole when we think about what we could give them in any way we could from afar. As the year has gone on, more has come up, but I think some of the biggest things that we also focused around inequity at this central level is when you think about as we entered into the summer and folks started to believe that we could reemerge potentially or get back to school normally, it became clear we couldn't. But one of the biggest challenges we confronted as a school system early on was that our private schools in the city were going to be able to remain open. And purely because of the fact of some of the health restrictions in place, their schools are smaller and they have more ability within their facilities to facilitate the health and safety standards that everyone has to follow. But when you think about our school system and our buildings and the number of students we serve, which is over 45,000 students, being able to serve a small population under those guidelines would make it almost impossible. It is impossible to bring all our students today still back 5 days a week. given the health restrictions in place and safety restrictions. So that was something that drove all of us as leaders too, to think about what can we prioritize to make sure we can get our youngest learners, who are going to likely fall farthest behind academically by not being in person soon. So that was a gap but it was pressure because we knew our private school counterparts could be in school every day. And that really drove us, again, the sense of urgency to problem solve and to help see where we can close as many gaps as possible, which led us thankfully in September to have K-5 back in ways that we needed to. And I think lastly too, one thing that is not sort of a typical challenge of a school district, but given this, that does present the inequities that we see in our community is around testing access. So, which now we're in the day of vaccines, which is an exciting time for our educators and our community. But just over a month ago, there was severe concern and panic almost around being able to know if you're positive for the virus. And one of the arms of work that I was charged with too was thinking about how do we get testing to school sites or ensure teachers access to testing as best as we could. And this is still a challenge that we continue to work on, but the idea of even when we think about our neighborhoods and inequities around hospital access, some of our hospitals are not equally accessible to all of our students and families or neighbors in New Orleans. And so we really took a lot on our end to think about how do we then take our position and work with hospital systems and the city health department to bring as much equity and access to our students. And one of the elements that drove us was the NBA is playing, right? So why can't we get testing like the NBA? I'm still dreaming for the testing like the NBA. What we really tried to do is think about what we knew was inequitable in our system and look at the systems where the crisis was not impacting them and just really doggedly fighting for what we thought was right for our students, which led to us being probably one of the only sort of districts in Louisiana to support and enable rapid antigen testing across all of our school sites, thanks to the entrepreneurial spirit of our school leaders who are willing to take on more responsibilities. But our hope was so that students and families who may not be able to get to a local hospital or may not, given the challenges that they face around economic hardship, work, etc., that we could make sure any resource needed once we were back in school was there. So I'll stop, Alison, I feel like I'm talking too much, but on the whole, what this has really done is, from our role at the central level, to really be focused on how do we give our students what they need now and prioritize that and really continue to focus. We've always focused on closing inequities, and this just really created a new sense of urgency and an opportunity really to push harder on areas like the tech divide that we've been able to do.
Thank you so much for that, Dina. So Melanie, as a school leader, you're dealing with all of these challenges that Dina just highlighted, and it is your role specifically to fix them for your students and families, as well as dealing with the needs and challenges of your faculty and staff, and providing that face of leadership. And so for me, I certainly was not in any way unaware of the inequities that already existed within our system, but they were brought to me in very stark reality by having a first grader in public school, having the ability when schools closed to work having a job where I could work a flexible schedule, or where I had the great good fortune of being able to hire tutors when I could not provide the education that my daughter needed and school was not accessible. As a leader, how do you think about this level of inequity, and how do you create parity for your students and families, as well as deal with the challenges of providing leadership and stability for your faculty and staff?
Well, great question. This has definitely been a year. And I would say that our school, Élan, was founded with the mindset of eradicating a lot of the inequities that we see in education by providing a high quality program for anyone, regardless of zip code or family income, social economic status, excuse me. But I think for the rest of the world that may have been blind to this, COVID-19 became the Windex to wipe off all of the myths that, hey, this is a reality that schools are facing across the nation. We see it every day. And so for us, we are a predominantly Black school, but we are also economically diverse. So we have been aware internally of what that looks like and what divide that creates, where we do have families that have tutors and can work from home. And then we have other families who may work 2 and 3 jobs. And so when we received that notification that schools were closing with the rest of the city, it was an immediate thought of thinking of, well, what's Maslow's hierarchy? How do we ensure our students have safety, wellness? And for us, the big piece from the wellness, as Dina mentioned, was first, a lot of our students come to school knowing that they will receive nutrition. So how are we making sure that they are receiving breakfast and lunch or snack? And so for us, it was quickly getting those non-perishable meals ready to go. But then you face another challenge. So being a leader in this space is like one challenge to another challenge. And so you have the food there for your students, but what about families that don't have transportation? Well, buses aren't running. Let's put the food on the buses and drop them off to the families that don't have access to those meals. And so we had to just really get creative extremely quick in order to make sure that we were enabling all of our families to receive what they needed to for their scholars. When we think around education, we quickly, that weekend, we started making packets because we didn't know how we were going to deliver instruction that next week. And we ran a drive-through behind the school where parents could come through the carpool line and pick up the materials so that their students could continue to learn. Our school was up and running virtually by that next Tuesday, which was very rare. And we had to just learn on the fly and continue to move. We were thankful when additional laptops came from Orleans Parish for our students, along with hotspots. And then again, if parents didn't have the access to get them, utilizing those buses, or myself and my teachers going to those families and saying, hey, we'll leave it on your porch. So we just had to really rally together to push so that we could just get it done. Then you had the next level of, well, what about our special needs students? How do we ensure that they are having success? Sitting behind a computer for 8 hours a day. So for me as a leader, it became seeking out community partners, nonprofits that are already doing the work, who can help to provide additional capacity for us. So the Bridge program, they normally support middle schoolers, but during that time they said, we'll support anyone, just give us a call. And they assisted our families who had difficulty accessing Zoom from a tech divide space. We also had counseling that continued for our families. This was a time where we had a lot of loss, even for my teachers, because of COVID-19. And so when you are facing a tragedy, or if you're a child and you don't really understand, you're watching your parent grieve and you're trying to understand, and you can't go to school and be with your friends and have any kind of outlet. How do we support those students? And so we wanted to make sure that we continue to provide counseling services. We never stopped our special education services for our families. And then we wanted to ensure that for our teachers, they had support, right? I think during this time, the world is seeing our teachers are essential workers, and they should have the highest level of respect. I always advocate for teacher pay. I always advocate for benefits for teachers. And this was a time for the world to see how incredible and how important they are. My team really went the extra mile. So we wanted to make sure that they had access to testing. We partnered with the urgent care facility to come in bi-weekly to test our teachers. We provided counseling for them as well, because they lost individuals during this time. And then we also made sure to have social emotional learning taking place for our students. So incorporating some of those curriculums. I think the communication has been incredibly important. And COVID just allowed for schools to have the resources to do the work that we already wanted to do, and to resolve some of the issues that we've already known to exist. But I just don't want us to feel as though, well, we have technology now, everything is fine. No, the inequity is still there, and we still have a lot of work to do to create an equitable school system.
Speaking of partnerships and the importance of community partnerships, that's an excellent segue. Patty, you and Entergy have been longtime supporters, advocates, and partners for many community-based organizations. One of Teach for America's longest standing and most ardent supporters. And so you've dealt with COVID over the past year. You were huge supporters in post-Katrina recovery. This is almost, old hat for Entergy at this point, from large scale crises to small things like floods or, a hurricane that may or may not happen, or a power outage, or, you guys were amazing responders to the tornadoes that happened in New Orleans East 3 or 4 years ago. So can you share how your team thinks about leadership and these partnerships in terms of creating equity, and what was different about the past year and how you changed the way that you responded because of the breadth and scale of this type of crisis?
Thanks, Alison. So absolutely, we have a long history of experience of dealing with crises and disasters. And what that has shown us is that in times of crisis, it's always the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable families in our communities who suffer the worst and who have the longest road to recovery. And so we based our approach to COVID on those learnings, and we targeted our response to address the economic hardships of those who were impacted the most, primarily low-income working families, the elderly, and the disabled in our communities. That's really where we targeted our efforts. We awarded grants totaling almost $3.4 million to over 80 nonprofit organizations across 4 states that were addressing primarily the economic hardships of those vulnerable individuals and families who were impacted by COVID. Some examples of our investments included, we helped start the Hospitality Cares Pandemic Fund here in New Orleans with United Way of Southeast Louisiana and the Louisiana Restaurant Association that enabled the organizations to provide over 4,000 emergency grants to hospitality workers immediately. I want to say it was within 2 weeks of launching the fund that $500 grants started going out to families of hospitality workers in our communities. Another example is a grant that we made to the Auctioner Foundation to enable them to rapidly ramp up training programs that provided opportunities for hospitality workers that had been furloughed so that they could learn new skills that they could put to work in the hospital business in helping them address a critical shortage of workers in the healthcare space associated with the COVID crisis. So those are a couple of examples of how we addressed the COVID issue across our 4-state area. Moving into the education space, we were, one of the things that has stuck in my mind is a meme that was prominent on social media at the time. And the meme said, COVID is like the collapse of the Roman Empire, but with Wi-Fi. Except for those families who lacked Wi-Fi access, they were completely cut off. It really brought forth the stark disparities between the haves and the have-nots. The digital divide was made so much more stark as a result of COVID. If you had ability and access to access the internet and to work from home, you were able to stay safe. Your family was able to stay safe. Your children were able to continue learning. But if you did not have that luxury, then it was a very dire situation for many, many families. And so we partnered with community partners to address that situation. Within the first week after New Orleans went into lockdown, a member of the Orleans Parish School Board reached out to us and said, we realize this is not going to be a short-term situation. This is going to be a long-term reality, and we need to help our students deal with this now. And they saw that there was going to be a shortage of devices, that soon school districts across the country were going to be competing for a relatively limited supply of Chromebooks and laptops. And so they had the foresight to say, we need to raise money now to make sure that technology is available for our students in Orleans Parish. And so they asked Entergy to help seed a $2 million drive to raise the funds to purchase laptops and hotspots for students in Orleans Parish. And that first week, we committed to seeding that fund with $100,000. And so that was how we started. And we continued. Other examples include an initiative where we are now refurbishing and will be providing donated laptops and equipments to students across our 4-state area from Entergy's normal inventory. So, you know, every few years, the laptops and the equipment that we use are replenished and restored. And so instead of making those available for sale on a retail basis, we are making them available for donation to school districts and schools across our service area. There's an initiative that Procter & Gamble has created nationwide called Take on Race, and it identifies 5 key areas where corporations can take action to address the equity issue, one of those being the digital divide. And Entergy is participating in this initiative to help put 1 million devices, 1 million connected devices into the hands of Black and Brown students across the country by the end of 2021. So that's another initiative that we're working on. And then finally, one last thing that I'll mention, in partnership with the Arkansas Department of Education, we awarded a grant of almost $500,000 to create online certification courses for vocational and career education that would be available for high school students across the state of Arkansas, that will enable them to earn industry recognized credentials for living wage jobs that they can earn while they are in high school and at home and online. And so those are some of the things that Entergy is doing to address the equity issue, the digital divide, and the challenges posed to our communities by COVID.
Thank you so much. So going from large national corporation to local small business, Jacob, you spent many, many years as an education leader and an equity advocate, and have now moved into being an entrepreneur, a startup leader, and a small business owner. So you've faced both sides of these challenges. I know that you were able to adapt. How did you think about equity and leadership during this crisis? And how did you pivot with your business model to both continue your business operations, but then also support that community need?
Yeah, hey, Alison, thanks. I love that question. So I made a pretty huge career shift a few years ago, went from almost a decade in public education to making beer for a living. And it's been a really great shift. But one thing that, certainly
when necessary.
We're essential workers, that's for sure. But we, when you spend a decade working on the issues that Teach for America seeks to address and that, Dina and Melanie address every single day, you can't leave that behind you. That's part of you. And even as even in a for-profit business, much in the way that Entergy serves as a community partner here, part of our core values as a company is really to be a deep community partner. And so that means a lot of things. It means that we never say no to a beer donation, but it also means that we have a $14.50 minimum wage for our employees because we live in a city that is, fairly expensive to live in compared to a lot of those around us. And we want people to be able to work here, make a living here, and make a career out of it, and be able to support themselves and their families And so we're at about 40 people today, and that's where we were going into the pandemic. And so the very first thing on our mind when overnight all bars and restaurants in the city were closed, and about 80, what seemed to be about 80% of our revenue was going to go away immediately. Our first concern was, how do we keep our people whole? We consider our employees our family, and they are incredibly valuable, and we don't want to lose them. And we also wanted to make sure they could eat and live through what, at that moment, we had no idea what we were heading into, no idea how long it would last. And so we immediately just set up a weekly call with all staff and were as transparent as possible. And it was really the first foray into open books accounting with our team, and being just completely transparent about this financial situation of the company and how we were going to approach this. And so our first approach was just, look, we're going to take it paycheck by paycheck, and we're going to commit that this next paycheck, you were going to make what you made last paycheck. Because we also, not only do we have a lot of salaried employees, but we have a lot of front of house bartenders who work on tips largely, and who make a pretty good living on tips. And those were completely dried up as well. So we approached it that way for about the first month. And then the opportunity to make hand sanitizer came our way. And this wasn't something we sought. It just, we heard that there was a need. In fact, my state representative gave me a call and said, look, the state's looking for hand sanitizer. Can't find it. What can you do? So I called some of our chemical suppliers. I called our bottle suppliers. And I figured that I think we could do this. We know how to put liquid into containers, even though this isn't a can like we normally do. We can't use our normal equipment. We knew, I knew we could figure out a way to do it. And so we put a bid into the state, and we won the bid. And all of a sudden we had to figure out a way to make 250,000 bottles of hand sanitizer. And I looked at it as an opportunity to have no doubt that we were going to keep our people going, keep our people busy, keep our people employed. It was still an incredibly stressful time. We were asking bartenders to fill bottles very manually with hand sanitizer. So not something that they had necessarily signed up to do, but it was also a way for us to just ensure that, they were going to eat, and that they were going to, have that paycheck continue to come in, even when there was tremendous uncertainty as to whether we were going to still be able to sell beer. And so that ended up being a very interesting and challenging foray, but pretty critical to just our operations as a business this year. The really rewarding thing as well was that it gave us an opportunity to meet a critical need. There was a very real shortage of that raw material, both on kind of the packaging material side and the liquid side in the community. And so we were able to get that in the hands of the state. We made some pretty big donations to local school districts, to Orleans Public Schools, to Jefferson Parish Public Schools. We were able to get it into the hands of East Jefferson Public Hospital, St. John Sheriff's Department. And so organizations all over our own community were able to get access to something that they were having a hard time accessing. And so from that perspective, it allowed us to continue that kind of community-minded mission. And then as the year has gone on and things, I won't say they ever really settled, but as we were a little more accustomed to what the new reality was, we were able to pick back up on some of the ways that we contribute to the community otherwise, which, some examples of that are, we were able to do a couple of community-driven beers where we donated all the proceeds to causes that we believe in. We participated in a national initiative called Black is Beautiful, and at both of our locations. We also have a brewery in Houston. So in Houston, we were able to donate the proceeds from that beer to the local chapter of Black Lives Matter. And in New Orleans, we donated to the Youth Empowerment Program. We also created a beer called Coastal Harmony, where we got other southern coastal breweries to all brew a beer and donate those proceeds to recovery from the many. It started out as recovery from the hurricane in Lake Charles, but there were so many hurricanes that we just asked our other brewery partners to target it to organizations in their own community, because pretty much every coastal community, it seemed, this year was hit in some way by a hurricane. And so that was, nice to be able to get back into our normal groove of being okay as a company and being able to start back with the contributions that we like to make in a few different ways to our local community and neighborhoods.
Thank you so much for that. So this really is the epitome of what leadership looks like, both in crisis and just in general. And so I really want to say thank you all so much for what you're doing every day for our community. So with that, I'd like to do just a quick whip around, if everybody could give their thoughts. So, 15 years ago, we all had to deal with Hurricane Katrina, which was a huge crisis, and we recovered from that. We're now dealing with COVID, and I do think that we will recover from this as well. But given the leadership that you all have shown over the past year and what you've learned, what are some of the things you feel that you can do or our community can do to future-proof against whatever the next crisis may be? Patty, would you like to start?
That's a big question. And one place that I would start is in terms of looking at resiliency. And what can we do to strengthen our organizations, our infrastructure, and our institutions to be more resilient against the storms that are going to come, whether they are physical storms like hurricanes or societal storms like the social justice and political unrest that we have seen. I think one thing that we can do that would address our ability as a society to be more resilient is to look at equity issues across the spectrum in our society. And a lot of that has started with a lot of companies and a lot of organizations already over the course of the past year in response to the issues that have been raised. But we've only begun to scratch the surface, and we need to continue to dig in more to address those issues for sure.
I'll say too that one thing that got us through the uncharted waters was just having a set of core values, and when we realized there was no roadmap to this, I think just basically used those to guide us. And I think I'm a little concerned that we've gotten, certainly nationally, and I think New Orleanians seem like pretty well aligned in general, but I think as a state too, we're not incredibly aligned right now on just what are our core values as people and as neighbors and as people that really have to fight all of these challenges together. And I think some of that has just been the national discourse. And so I think we have to find a way regionally to realign on what are our values as people and as neighbors. And I think we almost have to do that first before we can address the problems, because we all need to at least be starting from some common place and recognize that the challenges that we need to address are ones that we all agree are challenges. And sometimes in a post-fact environment, it's hard to find the starting place. And so I think that's what we can do, at first and foremost in our neighborhoods, in our city, but then I think as a state as well, we've got to figure out how to get back to some level of unity and agreement on some very basic principles.
I think we have to address systemic racism. Alison, when you made the statement, we've recovered from Katrina, it made me really think about it. Like, no, we haven't. Or to say that, oh, we will recover from COVID, but no, like, what does recovery really, really look like? Because when issues such as a storm arises or something like this, that was a pandemic, Black people received the brunt of the impact, and COVID-19 showed us that. And so if we don't address everything, not just education, but the healthcare system, the cost of housing in our communities, then every time something happens, we're going to continue to feel the brunt of that. The mental healthcare, the supports around all of these areas, if nothing changes, we'll continue to fall into the same pattern every single time that it happens. So I highly encourage people to not let COVID-19 and the impact be another story to say, oh, we recovered, everything's great, and we're back. It's like, no, people are still struggling from this and will continue to do so, especially in the Black community.
Yeah, Melanie, I think that that's extremely important. The idea of, I agree. I don't think there's been the recovery. I don't know what will happen. I think, but the idea of investing in what we probably honestly knew before Katrina, before this, are areas within our communities that need investment, education, like all the things Melanie said. I just think we have to invest. We have to get smarter and actually decide that we don't want to see and witness the pain of others the way we have if we haven't been directly impacted by it. And how do we do that now versus in the moment of crisis? And one other thing, I think that to your point around foolproofing, it's a really interesting idea. I don't know if we can, but I think we were all able to sort of share ways in which we felt from our positions, we've helped or were able to tackle some of the challenges. I think it's important at this moment, as you start to emerge and think about lessons learned, to reflect on where it didn't go right and where the roadblocks really held us back from doing more beyond what we did do to help in moments of crisis. So there's prevent the crisis in terms of the pain that will come, but then also reflect on what didn't go well, and then change those policies and those practices and those systems now. Before the next crisis hits, because otherwise we'll be in the same place. And there's things that systematically prevent us all from probably having the impact that we want to have in these times to help our community.
Right. And thank you so much for that reflection, Melanie. Thank you so much for pointing that out. I think that potentially an important thing is reframing exactly what recovery really does mean. And defining that to be inclusive for all communities in order for everybody to bring their full leadership to bear and to get that leadership to address all of these inequities that we're thinking about. I can't tell you how much I appreciate everybody being a part of this. This has been a wonderful hour to spend with everybody and hear all of your thoughts. Thank you to our NOLA guests for joining us today. I hope this conversation was as insightful for you as it was for me. To hear more stories of leadership and impact in our 30 for 30 series, please follow Teach for America Greater New Orleans on Instagram and Twitter at @TFA_GNO or on Facebook at @TFA Greater New Orleans. We'd like to thank Entergy again for helping us make this series possible and for their 20 years of partnership and support. Have a wonderful week at NOLA.